I'm Sean DeLaney, and you're listening to What Got You There. What Got You There is a must-follow for entrepreneurs, creatives, high achievers, and change makers. Each week, I sit down with some of the world's most influential people and focus on the journey behind their success. We uncover the strategy, tactics, and routines that help them get there. Now it's your journey, so it's time to learn what's going to get you there.
What got you there with Sean DeLaney? What got you there with Sean DeLaney? What got you there with Sean DeLaney? What got you there with got you?
Very difficult to ignore criticism, even when you know it's unconstructive, right? If somebody is insulting you or your work, and you know it's baseless, it's hard to ignore it. But becoming better at that, I think, is a way to be more productive and also to feel better about yourself. So you can't sort of let your surroundings define you, even if you shouldn't be completely cut off to criticism either.
What got you there with Sean DeLaney?
Brit Brogaard is a professor of philosophy and the director of the Brogaard Lab for Multisensory Research at the University of Miami. Her educational background includes a medical degree in neuroscience and a doctorate in philosophy. Her areas of research include perception, synesthesia, blindsight, consciousness, neuro-psychiatry, and emotions. On this episode, Professor Brogaard takes us inside the lives and brains of geniuses, savants, and a wide variety of ordinary people who have acquired truly extraordinary talents one way or another. She also dives deep on her work ethic, frameworks she's implemented, and how her research has impacted her approaches to life.
Making change transpire. That's the mission behind the most amazing tasting protein bar brand taking the nutrition industry by storm. That brand, they're MCT Co, and they make the most delicious, keto-friendly, all-natural collagen protein bars. If you're obsessed with the quality of food going into your body like I am, then head out and pick up these amazing bars jammed with 10 grams of collagen protein. They only have 2 to 3 net carbs, no added sugar, and loaded with high-quality MCT oil for the healthy fats from coconuts. Whether you're busy running the kids around from activity to activity, a professional athlete, or just someone looking for a great-tasting convenience snack, do yourself a favor, head to mctco.com and use code WGYT for 20% off your order. Britt, welcome to What Got You There. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Yes, I'm very excited for this one. You have an interesting career since your research has both been around neuroscience and then also philosophy. And I would love to know kind of the origin story of your fascination and interest. So when did you first get involved and interested in these topics?
I was interested in neuroscience and the brain initially, but then when I did neuroscience or studied neuroscience, I sort of lacked a little bit of the big picture. So that's when I started taking an interest in philosophy in sort of roundabout ways. And so I did actually study a little bit of cognitive linguistics before I realized that the really big picture that I was interested in was the philosophical picture of consciousness and the mind and so on, but empirically informed. So that's where the neuroscience still comes in to the picture.
So you want to take hard sciences to be able to understand some of those bigger existential type questions?
Yeah, so of course that's debatable whether you can answer the hardest questions on empirical grounds, but at least I think you can answer some of those questions using the empirical sciences.
Very interesting. I know we're going to dive a lot into that, but I'm really intrigued, and a lot of research I've done into you is just about your prolific work ethic, and you seem to be one of those people who can push themselves incredibly hard. Have you always been like that?
Yeah, I think I have always been like that, but I've not always been like that academically. I initially wanted to be a writer, an author. So I did back in my home country, Denmark, publish a young adult novel and some poetry. And I thought that maybe I could make a living being an author, but I guess it's very difficult, especially when the country has like 5 or 6 million people, and a lot of them, of course, don't buy books. So that's when I I decided to go to the university, and I entered academia. So yeah, in some sense, I've always been like that, but not necessarily in the same area.
So what shifted when you switched over to academia? Did you have a different mindset, a different thought process, or was it still the same person just trying to tackling a new subject?
Yeah, it's interesting because some of the things I wrote that I never really published, meaning I wrote a novel, but I never sort of polished it enough to see if it could get published. That explored a philosophical question about the mind. So it's basically a kind of locked in scenario, someone who is completely locked in, meaning they cannot communicate with the external world, but are completely conscious on the inside. So there are examples of that, of course, in reality. But in those cases, you have at least some possibility of blinking your eyes and in that way communicating with the world. So the book, or the idea that I was exploring, was sort of the idea of being conscious without any ability to communicate with the external world.
What about your relationship with failure? I'm asking because I know you have that deep-rooted science background, and I would love to just know how that plays into how you approach problems. I know you take on very difficult challenges and are known to go against the grain almost. So I'd love to get your approach and just your overall thoughts around failure.
Yeah, so there are many aspects to failure. So one is rejection. So whether you're trying to publish books or you're publishing articles, you're going to have to get used to live with rejection, because it's very rare that people just sort of write a novel and send it out, and there was an agent, and then it got published, and then maybe they went into academia, and then whatever they wrote in academia or just got published, right? So you have to expect rejections and learn to live with rejections, and that's, I think, is initially hard for most people to learn to not take it personally. That if you have a rejection, and sort of see if you can find something positive in that rejection, especially if you got some comments back on your work, you can use it to make it better.
Was there a point in your career when you started to be able to embrace that and take on these failures and learn from them better?
Yeah, I think when I still thought maybe I would make a living out of writing fiction, I think that I didn't necessarily learn as much from rejection. So I did with poetry, for example, have rejections also published in poetry magazines, and some of it was accepted, some of it was rejected. But my approach back then was very much just like, okay, let's write something else. I didn't sort of go back and revise what I had to see if I could make it better. Just let's write something else. In graduate school and afterwards, I think I started to learn to look at the comments that I received more carefully. So the comments in the case of publications, but also, of course, I know comments if you realize that your own theory or your own experiment doesn't work. But I think I started sort of modifying my ideas more, so I went back to the same ideas and tried to look at them from a new angle. So that's a different, a more productive approach than just giving up on what you had and doing something completely new.
Do you have an example of, let's call it, looking back at an old problem in a new way? I'm curious how you do that, because I want to be able to learn from you. I want the listeners to. And if we face rejection and we've got to go back at a problem, I'm wondering how you approach it differently.
Yeah, so of course there are many examples of that. So my last academic book, for example, where I was working on the idea of language being a kind of a resource for working out perception. So this specifically was words like see and look and seem and so on. And that took me a while. So I actually worked on that book for many years because initially it didn't really work what I wanted to do. And so in this case, it was I kept working on the idea, but I think I narrowed instead of like looking at perceptual language more generally, I focused on a specific part, and so I made the problem easier to solve in a way by narrowing it down. So in this case, it was an example of focusing instead of necessarily taking a new approach, but you can still look at it as a new approach in the sense that you have less to deal with if you can sort of narrow down the problem.
Oh, that's interesting. I've heard you're one of the most intensely focused people there are. Is this something you classify yourself as?
Yes, I think I'm able to focus in a way. I obviously there are things that can distract me, but I am able to focus. I realized that actually when I went to the university in Denmark, back in Denmark. So my when I first started there, and I took some seminars where in Jutland, which was the other across the small ocean there from Copenhagen, and since I wasn't there regularly, I had to sit in the lunchroom and work. And at some point when I was working, somebody noticed that there was like a lot of noise and a lot of people talking because people were starting to arrive. And so there were like 10 people being loud in the lunchroom, but I didn't seem to get distracted. So it's not something I necessarily knew that I was able to do until somebody sort of pointed it out to me. But I am able to focus, which is not to say that there's nothing that can distract me, but I don't get easily distracted by external stimuli, and of course that can be a huge disadvantage too, because if I walk on campus, for example, and I'm thinking about some idea I have, for example, I'm really not conscious of my surroundings. So people often think that I'm rude because I don't actually greet them when I pass them, but I'm really not noticing them. So that can also be a disadvantage.
Unfortunately, that happens to me as well. Unfortunately, for the people close to us. You brought up something really interesting a minute ago, and I'd love to pull on this thread. You said you weren't even really aware of how deeply you could focus until someone pointed that out to you. I'm wondering how that changes when there's something innate in you that's pointed out, and it's almost like the curtain is peeled back where you were unaware of it before. How do you think that changes after that?
Well, it has only changed me in situations where perhaps the distraction was so intense that I was thinking like, well, I can't really focus because of this construction work outside, say. And then sometimes thinking back, well, maybe that's not true. Maybe I should just get started. And then I get started, and then I sort of, maybe I partially make it true because somebody pointed that out to me. So it might not be that that is all sort of innate, but also that when you believe that something is true about yourself, maybe you are more likely to cultivate that aspect. So even if I wasn't as good at sort of just attending to what I was doing and not attending to my surroundings, when the person pointed out that was the case, like believing that you can use that to your advantage. Of course, you can't make yourself believe stuff. That's not. I mean, you sort of have to really truly believe it, and then maybe that will partially make you cultivate that aspect of yourself.
Yeah, I heard you say that, and it just made me think to my own life. And certain times, someone had mentioned something that I was unaware of before, and then because of that small little thing they said, I started to cultivate that even more. And you were hitting on something that relates to this a second ago, just about belief. And I'm wondering what the narrative is like in your head around self-belief. Are you someone who just believes that you're capable of so much, even when others doubt you?
Not always. Over time, I think I've been able to filter out constructive criticism from criticism that's not constructive, whether intentionally or unintentionally not constructive. So there will be times when I get criticism and I'm able to see that, well, they're right about that, and that I should make some changes, right, to my work, or it could also be my way of being or my behavior, but also to my work. But in other cases, of course, there's criticism that you need to recognize as unconstructive criticism, and sometimes intentionally unconstructive. Sometimes it's just because people don't know better. So I think it just takes a little bit of time to become better at recognizing criticism that will help you, and sort of ignore criticism that will not help you. It's very difficult to ignore criticism, even when you know it's unconstructive, right? If somebody is insulting you or your work, right? It's baseless. It's hard to ignore it, but becoming better at that, I think, is a way to be more productive, and also to feel better about yourself. So you can't sort of let your surroundings define you, even if you shouldn't be completely cut off to criticism either.
Besides time and experience, is there anything that you've done that's helped you kind of step outside yourself there and take this constructive criticism and then filter out the non-constructive?
So could you ask that question again?
Yeah. You mentioned that a lot of this has to do with time and just experience in terms of getting constructive feedback and then also non-constructive feedback that can just be damaging. And you said the key is being able to filter that. And I'm just wondering, for someone who hasn't had as much experience and be able to filter that out, how could you go about doing that?
Yeah, so to filter out criticism, of course, it can help knowing, even if not much, but a little bit about human psychology. So, of course, we cannot all be psychologists, let alone clinical psychologists. But I think that if you just sort of start thinking a little bit about how people in general behave, and also realize that there are differences in people's personality and different reasons that people might be giving you criticism, whether it's criticism of what you're doing, your work, or your idea, or it's criticism of you. There might be situations where there wouldn't be a good reason for them to have ill intentions, and then you can sort of like start to think about like, well, how do people behave? Are they if it's your competitor who is criticizing you, well, then there's maybe some reason to be doubtful, or at least sort of be hesitating a bit before you internalize that criticism. If it's someone that's clearly has your best interests in mind, it's likely that the criticism is something you should like at least think about and consider. So I think like just thinking about human psychology, it doesn't have to be all that theoretical, but just being like reflecting on how people behave and where they're coming from, and what is the reason for giving you the criticism that they're giving you. Is it in a professional context? Is it a friend? Is it somebody who's envious of you, right? Or is it your competitor? So if you're sort of reflecting on human psychology and how people behave, I think that will help to filter out some of that criticism. Of course, it's not going to help necessarily to make you feel self-confident and sort of not take it personally, but I think it eventually it will go in that direction as well. If you start to think about like, okay, so what are their reasons? What are their like motivations for doing what they're doing?
Thank you, Britt. That was tremendously insightful. I'm so glad we went a little bit deeper on that. That was just very eye-opening, and one of those things that's often overlooked, so I appreciate that. We were just discussing in terms of your ability to focus and get into deep work, and you're someone who puts out just a tremendous, prolific amount of work and quality work at that. And I'm always interested when people are able to do that, especially over a long period of time. What is your day like? Are there certain work type structures you put in place in order to be able to put out that amount of work?
Yeah, it has changed, of course, over the years. So I have a daughter, but now she's she's a little bigger than she used to be. When you have a young child, it can be difficult, of course, to just structure your day the way that you want, because small children they don't respect the way that you necessarily structure your day. But so how do I structure my day? So starting with the presents, email can be enormously distracting, and it's sort of becoming a little bit of an obstacle to a lot of people. Of course, it's always nice to get an email from a good friend and so on, but you also have suddenly a huge number of emails from various people in your workplace, or people you don't know. If you also, like me, you're blogging, you might have comments on your blog posts that are showing up in your inbox, and so email, social media, and so on. I try to sometimes do that at the end of the day. So if I have to do something that's more creative, or I have to come up with something new, or I have to think carefully through theory, or design an experiment, or something like that, I might just like not open my email inbox at all until later at night, when I'm kind of like tired. Maybe I'm even like half watching television while I'm looking at my email. Of course, there will be some emails that can't be dealt with quickly and in sort of without attending carefully to them. But I think that if you start out in the morning by doing all this other stuff, that's not the work that you really want to produce, then the whole day can suddenly be gone doing that. Of course, it's sort of a balance act, because all these other things need to be done at some point as well. But I find it's easier sometimes to do the more the tasks that require a lot of thought, do those first. Of course, first for me, that nowadays means like in the morning or whenever I get up is when I'm most productive. That was not always the case. So I guess what I would recommend, like finding out when you are most productive and using that time to reflect on what requires like a lot of thought, and doing things like email, but also like searching a certain reference for a paper that I'm writing. That searching for a reference it can be time consuming, but it doesn't require a lot of thought, right? It's just sort of just time consuming. And so that's the kind of stuff that I would try to do later, or while I might be doing other things as well. I mean, something that I might be searching for a reference while I'm watching or half watching some show on television, for example.
Yeah, you bring up such a great point, though, about understanding what works best for you. And I think, unfortunately, so many people, they'll read a blog post or an article about you should be the most productive in the morning. And if that's not working for you, then there's no reason to continue that. It's about figuring out in the context of your own life what works best.
I think, naturally, I'm not a morning person in that sense. So when I was, before I had my daughter, I always worked at night and could also sort of work along, keep working into the night, right? Because I could sleep a bit longer in the morning, so I could make up for it in that way. So I think that it was sort of not by choice or because I'm naturally inclined to be productive in the morning, but because for very many years now, I've had to get up very early in the morning. And so you sort of get turned around a bit. And that might not be because you have children. It could also be because you have a job that requires you to meet at a certain time in the morning, or you go to school and your classes start at a certain time in the morning. And so you might be forced to be more productive in the mornings and less productive at night. But naturally, I would normally just work at night when everything was quiet and I could just continue working until I felt tired or I didn't have any more to think about, or I needed a break from a problem or something, right? So naturally, I think I was more of a night person, or am more of a night person.
Yeah, with regards to work and the times you do it, I read that you're one of those people who doesn't require much sleep. Is that true?
Yeah, it varies. I mean, it's again, it's sort of situation determined a little bit. So it's certainly true that when nothing else sort of is requiring your time and energy, I can get by with sort of relatively little sleep. It's probably still true. I would say that for people who have small children, for example, if your night is completely interrupted, you should probably not like try to force yourself to get by on very little sleep. So there have been times in my life when I felt like, well, I needed more sleep, but maybe it wasn't more sleep. It was just like, it was less quality sleep. So I needed more hours because it was less quality sleep. But yeah, if I'm not dealing with external stresses or it could be internal stresses, I think I can just like get some hours of good quality sleep. It can sort of vary a little bit, but it's maybe slightly less than average. But again, you can have some kind of situational pressures or internal conditions that make you, I mean, where your sleep is not very sort of productive, your sleep is not high quality sleep. So then obviously you will need more hours to make up for that.
Something you were saying a minute ago around your creative process. And I'm always intrigued about different people's creative processes. Is there anything you do? I know you mentioned just eliminating the email, but anything outside of that helps you get into the more creative juices flowing?
I tend to read a bit outside of my area sometimes. So maybe not to an extreme extent, but so depending on your area, it's hard to define exactly what it is for every person. But some people only read, for instance, in my field, only read what they're already working on and in their area. So, but if you actually sort of if you study things that are slightly outside of your area, that might actually influence your thoughts in your area in ways that might not be immediately obvious, but then later on, suddenly you remember having read something else and that might work to solve a certain problem in your area. So I think like one of the things that I'm particularly good at, sort of naturally, is to take two areas that absolutely do not fit together, and sort of make them fit together. But that sort of is the creative process, right? I mean, that's why we're talking about thinking outside the box, right? But that's essentially what it is, to use strategies that we that occur to us because of what we have heard about or seen or experienced in other areas, and use those strategies to sort of problem solve the areas or the problems in the area that we're working on. So when we talk about thinking outside the box, we're not talking about, we're just waiting for some miracle idea to come to us, right? I mean, that it may feel like this aha moment when you have a new idea for how to solve your own problems. But usually it's because of your experiences, including what, say, you read outside of your area, you you get some experiences outside of your area, that's usually why you have these insights that can feel like sort of genuine like insights that are not inspired by anything else, but usually they actually are inspired by something else.
Yeah, that entire cross-pollination of ideas is just endlessly fascinating to me, and it makes me think about your mentor, David Chalmers, and he said something about you, and that is, she is a master of bringing together ideas from different areas in surprising and powerful ways. And you mentioned just reading outside your domain-specific expertise. What are some of the things you are reading outside of your expertise?
So I have not, certainly not, well, still not. I'm not working, for example, in political philosophy, but I tend to read a lot of political philosophy, but also political science, and that's also because, of course, I have an interest in politics more generally. So it can help to have a little more theory to sort of process the information you get. But occasionally, for example, when I then read political philosophy and also legal philosophy, philosophy of law, it's a sort of related area that I'm also very interested in. Again, the interest is not purely, those are not really my areas. And so in some sense, it's not really an academic interest, but I often find that methods that are used in legal philosophy, for example, or legal theory, or in political philosophy, might be used to solve some completely different problems that are unrelated to those problems. So for example, there's a lot of political philosophy that talks about, obviously, about democracy. How do we really succeed in having a democracy where people's opinions are heard to some extent, right? Everyone's opinion in some sense is heard, and people voting, of course, is a way that you can have people hear people's opinions, but how also can you sort of ensure that debates are constructive? And so things like that have sometimes informed my work in more narrow areas, more theoretical areas of philosophy of mind, about disagreement, for example, or about, for example, not knowing, but maybe sort of estimating what people will do. So that's also what some people refer to as theory of mind. So predicting what people will do, or sort of reading what people are thinking, what their motivations are, and so on. So I think that's an example where I naturally read outside of my area into legal and political philosophy, but also because it relates to our everyday world. Like every time we turn on the television or the news channels or the radio, on a news channel, we hear about politics, right? Or some legal decisions or some Supreme Court decisions. And so to process that, I'm just interested in having those resources to do that, to process that information. But then it just sort of happens to also be helpful in other areas that are unrelated.
Yeah, you mentioned having those resources at your disposal, and I view these as different frameworks and different mental models, such as the understanding human psychology. You mentioned political philosophy. What are some of the other big, broad frameworks that have helped you just navigate some of the complexities of life?
So do you mean academic?
No, outside of academics. I'm thinking, like you were mentioning about human psychology, and that has helped you both in your career and then also in your life. And I'm wondering, what are some of those big, broad disciplines that just help you throughout everything you do in life?
Right. So clearly, psychology, even some very fundamental, basic psychology and personality psychology can be very, very helpful to sort of process where people are coming from, what their motives are, and so on. But also, philosophy of language, which does not necessarily have to be the philosophy of language. It can also be sort of linguistic semantics, pragmatics. That I think is enormously helpful to also discern what people's motivations are. So there's a big framework in philosophy of language / linguistics that concern sort of what we could call in ordinary language to read between the lines, but the technical term for that is sort of implicature, or what is implied by speech. So what is not said explicitly, but what is implied. And there's a big theory about that also relates to finding out if people are saying something that is reasonable and can be argued with, or if people are just saying something that's completely unreasonable. So an example from Rice, who's the father of this reading between the lines, you might say in ordinary language, is suppose that you see someone who's out of gas on the side of the road, and they ask you where they can find a gas station, and you happen to know that there's a gas station around the corner. You also know that gas station is closed for the summer. So you say, oh, there's a gas station around the corner. Now, of course, you didn't say anything false. Say, there's a gas station around the corner. Right? But when you walk away, that person is going to have taken you to have implied that it's a gas station where they can get gas. So one that's likely to be open, right, and is not out of gas, and so on. So in this case, of course, it's very unproductive to, in the example, the sort of extreme example where you're saying something that's clearly misleading. But a lot of cases like that, where in ordinary life, where you can think about what people explicitly saying and what they're implicitly saying, or why they're saying it, right? So which words politicians are using to answer a certain question. So if you see, like when you see the task force briefings, for example, nowadays, and people and the politicians, for example, answer a certain way to a question, you can sort of sometimes like become better at seeing where they're coming from. What they're not saying is sometimes more important than what they're saying.
Do you just feel like you're operating at a much higher level now that you kind of have a strong grasp on some of these big frameworks?
I do feel it's helpful to understand human behavior, but human minds more than their behavior. The behavior is maybe part of what you use to figure out what's inside people's minds. I think that's it's a really interesting problem. It happens to also be a problem in philosophy of mind, but it's also a problem that is helpful in almost any aspect of life, right? So just to get along with people, to complete a job interview well, to whether you're the one who's interviewing for the job or you're the interviewer of the job applicant, whether it's to interact with customers if you have a business, or you're going to the bank and you're trying to get a loan, like knowing more about people's what people sort of how they operate, and how different people, also that there are differences between people, and how to discern those differences between people, because people have very different personalities, and if you can sort of zoom in on those personalities, you might be better able to see where they're coming from, and what you would need to say or do to be successful. So, for example, say that you, well, clearly, if you work in advertisements, for example, right, understanding what the audience is that you're trying to advertise to. So that's an example, but in everyday life, how you interact with people it can't always be the same. That's not to say that you should not be yourself and you should be deceitful or something like that. But you can interact. You cannot interact with everyone in the same way and also be successful. It's just not how everyone works. So there's not sort of a single personality out there, and you can just like act in one way with respect to every person. So again, here we have a balancing act where you have to think about what are your values and what do you stand for, and how can you be yourself without being the same in every interaction and rubbing people the wrong way, for example. So that's something I think is something I've learned from both psychology and philosophy of language. And so those are some of the frameworks.
That's incredibly insightful and helpful. You've brought in the personalities a lot, and I'm wondering if you've done a lot of your own research into your own personality. Are there different personality tests, or is that something that you kind of scoff at and are not a believer in?
No, I think that the people who do work in personality psychology, they have to rely on and develop sometimes or rely on existing personality tests, because they're not very good ways of empirically investigating personality except by using testing groups of people and to figure something out about personality in that way. But I don't think that it's helpful on an individual level to use a personality test. That might be helpful to get you started on thinking about personality, perhaps. But the difference is that if you're a personality psychologist and you're looking at, say, 200 people, participants in a study, and you want to see what are the connections between extroversion, for example, and job success, right? You would have to distribute some sort of personality tests to find out, okay, who's like more extroverted and who's more introverted, and how successful are they, and so on. So this is about groups and statistical averages, or statistical numbers for that group. But on an individual level, if you take a personality test on an individual level, you wouldn't, so especially those personality tests that are not the clinical tests that are administered by psychologists. A lot of the tests that you find out online, the questions that are asked there, they don't work very well for everyone, and they might actually give you the wrong results. And also being told, if you do take a personality test and you take, say, the big 5 personality tests, and you're told that, say, oh, you're leaning towards extroversion and conscientiousness and openness, but you're not super agreeable. Well, those terms are very, very general. So I don't see that that's necessarily helpful. Furthermore, if you were to go and have a personality test administered by a clinical psychologist, so somebody who is practicing psychology or has a psychology practice, and you get a personality test, that they would need to interpret the results. So a lot of these tests are not sort of just like okay, it's not like giving you a number on a scale from 0 to 10 on, say, extroversion. There's a lot of interpretation going into interpreting clinical personality tests that are administered to individuals, and it's not something you can do yourself. So, but you can figure out how you are like by looking at what are called the facets of the different traits. So that's something that you can look up. So if there's one scale of measuring personality that's called the Big 5. And so that's the one that most people know about. It has the acronym OCEAN. So the O for openness, C for conscientiousness, E for extroversion, A for agreeableness, and N for neuroticism. And each of those dimensions of personality have 6 facets, and you can look them up. And so take extroversion, for example. There are many aspects of extroversion, and you might fall very differently in some of those aspects. So one part of extroversion is, do you need some significant amount of alone time to feel good sort of generally on a daily basis to sort of to flourish? Do you need a lot of alone time, which is not to say that you feel good about being isolated all the time, or do you need a significant amount of social interaction to feel good about yourself, right? So that's just one aspect or facet of extroversion, that dimension of personality. And so if you go into the other things like cheerfulness is another dimension. You might be you might have different results on those different facets. And so if you did want to look more at more theoretical aspects of personality psychology, it would definitely be helpful to sort of divide it up into the facets, so you get a better picture and understanding of who you are. But also, I'm not necessarily in favor of everyone, or I don't think, it's not that I'm in favor or not, but I don't think that people necessarily need to read theoretical personality psychology to understand themselves, right? It doesn't matter what these aspects of yourself are really called in personality psychology. So you can sort of almost just make your own aspects or facets for the things that, if you realize that, well, I really thrive when I have a significant amount of social interaction in my life. Okay, great. So you know that, right? Now, if that's officially is called something, even the fact that it falls under extroversion is less relevant. The fact is that if that's what you need, then that's what you can sort of thrive to do to feel better on an everyday basis.
Yeah, once again, this is all nuanced and contextual, but I think a good starting place for a lot of people. One thing I'm really intrigued about by you brought up a little while ago, is when you say you were thinking through different theories, and I'm just wondering about your overall learning process. I know we've talked about some of the big frameworks and things of that nature, but when you're starting to uncover something new and you're really digging deep on it, can you walk us through what that learning process is like for you? I'm even wondering, when you're reading something, you think of a new idea, or you cross-pollinated an idea, what are the next steps for you?
Yeah, I think I need to visualize it in some way. Maybe in some cases, the visualization is not in images, but can be like by writing down an outline, but it could also be, I mean, if it's an experiment, maybe it's a diagram, maybe it's something, it's not necessarily some diagram that has any formal word. It's just like a diagram I make up myself, or a flow chart, or that I just make up myself, or an outline, or so if I do make an outline where it's sort of text that I use to visualize what I need to do, I try to make it as detailed as possible. And then, of course, there are lots of points in that case, or there might be lots of points in your diagram or in your flow chart that are going to be blank, right? Because if you had the solution to the problem right away, or you had developed a theory already, and then, I mean, it was not much more work to do. Then you just sit down and write it. If something that has to be written, then you just sit down and write it out, and write it up. But these gaps then is something that you can start to explore, right? So depending on the area that you work in, the process of exploring those gaps are going to be different. So in some cases, it might be searching for information in library databases or online. In other cases, it might be conducting some empirical experiments, or getting some data from say consumers, or whatever it can be, to fill in the information. And sometimes when you then start to fill in the blanks, you have to then restructure your outline, or your diagram, or your flow chart. And so that's a bit how I work. So I have also, I'm not always, so it sounds like that's what I'm always doing, or have always been doing. It's not always what I'm doing, but I also often regret not doing it. And so, for example, I might have think I have a theory that's fully developed. Maybe I do have some ideas there that might work in the end, but I might even think, oh, I know, you can see how that theory is going to go. And then I will start writing a paper, for example, that's supposed to be publishable in some form, only to find out that too many gaps in that theory. So I basically was wasting a lot of time, because if you really are trying to write something that you think is going to be published, you're going to be a little more careful about what you write down. So you're potentially wasting a lot of time. So you have to throw out all that work potentially and start from scratch again. So I do often go back and think, oh yes, I should have made a better outline, and identified the areas where I needed to do a little more research, or figure out how to solve certain problems before I could just sort of sit down and say, write it up, or conduct the experiments, for that matter.
Yeah, this is going to be a follow-up, somewhat nuanced question. And I'm wondering, what do you think your highest leverage activity is? Meaning, is it sitting down and mapping out your thoughts? Is it exploring new research, reading? Anything that you just find the most amount of value when you do it?
Yes, it sort of depends on where you are at in terms of a project or a task that you're trying to complete. Sometimes if I'm thinking of something completely new, right, where I'm not in the middle of, if I don't already have some ideas, but I'm thinking like, maybe I have a vague idea that I want to explore. I do some personal brainstorming sometimes, but not necessarily in the sense that I just sit down and then I put thoughts down on a piece of paper, but I might do that in combination with reading up on different stuff. But reading up on different stuff might also involve a lot of reading an abstract of something, of a paper, realizing, okay, that's not what's gonna work for your project, and going to another paper, or you might even start reading, say, a paper, and then it was not what you really needed after all, so you don't necessarily finish reading that paper. But then in the meantime, you might sort of be brainstorming, because you have you have to have at least some vague idea of what you're trying to do to get it started. But then to sort of explore that, you would sort of get input from what you read, or what you research or look at online and so on. You get input that way, and that will also let you be your partner in your brainstorming process. Will be the information that you find through the library databases, or online, or by talking to, you might also be talking to other people to solve some of those problems, even if it's your own project and you're not really genuinely brainstorming with other people.
Oh, that's really intriguing. You mentioned putting down some of the papers when you're not getting out of it what you hope to. Is that something that's very important to you, is just being able to quickly identify and sift through important pieces of information?
Yeah, so I think that sometimes in our educational system, and I mean mostly like college, which is what I'm doing, right? So it's not structured necessarily the right way. So I'm thinking of having students read a ton of material, and then you're testing them on that, or you're asking them to write a paper afterwards on that material. I think that's not the best way to go about it. So the better way to go about it, of course, you have to have some basic knowledge. So some reading, you will need to do some reading, of course, to even get like any idea of what you're going to do. But the best way to, say, if you're writing a paper or a blog post or a story, a newspaper article, I think is to, at least once you have this basic outline, and you need to find out what you need to, what kind of information you might be looking for. It's better to be reading the things that are relevant to that project that you're completing, right? So instead of just sort of reading for no reason at all. Except, of course, you have to have some basic knowledge, but reading very, very detailed technical work as students sometimes are asked to do, without it being related to a project, can be unproductive, and it doesn't, it's shown in psychology that it doesn't help people remember that information very well. Now, when I said before that I read outside area in political philosophy or legal philosophy, that is not sort of just random reading, right? Because I have an interest, like most people, in what's going on in our society, and to process that information, I'm interested in reading legal theory and political philosophy. So I have a different motivation for reading it and remembering it. It's not like I have to remember it just for the sake of remembering it. I'm motivated, right? I don't have to work on remembering it, because when there's interest, then you remember the material. But that's sort of the reading outside of your area. If you're in a specific area, I think it's better to find out what kind of information you need. And so that it's not necessarily reading 5 papers. It might end up being reading 5 papers, even reading 15 papers, because you're looking for something specific that you can use to solve your problem. But then it also might not involve reading 15 papers from start to finish, right? So you can sort of, if you know where you are in your project and what kind of information you're looking for, you can sort of quickly determine whether a certain kind of article is relevant to your project and can help you.
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong here, but it's almost like building a house. You need to have a right structure and the framing before you can get into the nuance in terms of the electrical wiring and all of the little ideas. Is that kind of the little nuance of this? You need big picture first, and then you can get deeper on the details.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think that's another way to put it. That's one aspect of it. Okay. I also think it's like, suppose you were to build your own house, you don't have to study plumbing, every aspect of plumbing and every aspect of how walls are constructed. You would just need to study those aspects that would go into building a house, right? So there's a lot of plumbing in a house that's not the whole field of plumbing. So there's a lot of plumbing that you wouldn't have to have knowledge about in order to complete the plumbing in your house. So you wouldn't have to know how to construct a tower in a big city in order to build a house, right? So there are people who work in areas where they get that information. But if you have this project of building a house, you need a little bit of information about how to build a wall, the kind of wall that goes into a house, or how to do plumbing in your house, or how to do the electricity in your house. But you wouldn't have to know everything about electricity or about plumbing or about building walls or anything like that.
Yeah, you bring up a great point. Hence why you're the featured guest and I'm just the one behind the microphone here. So thank you for clearing that up. Do you have a few more minutes? I know we're kind of running up on time here.
No, that's fine.
Yeah, because we haven't even gotten into to a lot of your work, which is how I first came about you. So I know back in 2015, you wrote the book, The Superhuman Mind, Free the Genius in Your Brain. And I'm just wondering how you define, for people unfamiliar with your work, just the superhuman mind.
Yeah, so we found some in our laboratory, the lab that I run, where it's mostly student run. We found some individuals who had brain injuries or would hurt their heads in various different ways, who had the typical disabilities that you have after a brain injury, but who also had some sudden talents and motivations that they didn't have before. So there is an example of a public figure that we have studied, Derek Amato, who hurt his head by jumping into the shallow end of a pool. And before the accident, he was interested sort of in sports, not at a professional level, but he was also a salesman, and that was his job. And he was certainly not interested in music, but he suddenly, after he came to, so he sort of more or less slept for 3 days after the brain injury or traumatic brain injury, and suddenly he had an interest in playing the piano, and we don't know what it sounded like when he went and played the piano the first time, because nobody, I mean, he might not remember correctly and we weren't there. But what we do know that it didn't take long before he actually was playing the piano, where he was invited to play at around the country, and also put out a couple of albums. And so whether the motivation came first, and then he became very good at playing the piano as a result of the accident, or the talent sort of was developed by hurting the head in a certain way, we don't really know. But what we do know is that if that restructuring that we know takes place when you hurt your head in a certain way, it's not to recommend anyone to go and hurt the head intentionally, but in some few lucky cases, there's a restructuring going on in the brain that creates a certain talent in some way that we don't fully know yet how that's developed. But that suggests that that we do have a kind of potential so it's not necessarily the genetic material that we happen to have, though of course that puts some limitations, or can certainly put some limitations on what we can do. But clearly the genetic material doesn't determine what you're gonna do or be good at, right? Because Derek Amato, he thought he was gonna be good at selling things. He was a salesman. He probably was good at it. And then it turned out that he was really, really good at playing the piano. Well, if the genes were the determining factor, then that wouldn't have happened, right? So then you would just say, well, it would have to be genetically determined that he should play the piano. But then why would the accident be needed for him to play the piano? Another example is also a public figure, Jason Paget, who all hurt his head and started after the brain accident, brain injury. He started drawing geometrical shapes, and he gained a more full understanding of certain areas of mathematics. And before that, both before and after the accident, he was working in a furniture store. He also worked, of course, after the accident in a furniture store, in the same furniture store, because it's not like becoming good at, say, mathematics or certain areas of mathematics, or at drawing certain shapes and mathematical shapes that immediately allow you to quit your job. But so he was working in a furniture store, and so again, he was a salesperson specifically in a furniture store. But clearly, the genes you're born with then would not determine what kinds of things that he is going to be good at, right? So of course, in these cases, it's not something that they could control, and it's not something that we currently can control, but it does show that we have a certain potential that's not genetically determined. I mean, so that we have more possibilities than perhaps we think that we do have.
Yeah, that's how I first came across your work, and why I got so excited about just really exploring the depths of human potential. And one of the things I'd love to dig into the specifics on, you were talking about Amato and his ability to play a musical instrument. You were talking about math as well. So is it at all clear if, let's put this in terms of math, if the information is already in your head, or if you're just able to rapidly learn on it? Any idea there?
It's difficult with mathematics to answer the question fully, and perhaps with music too, because mathematics, of course, I mean, there's a certain basic knowledge you have to. If you don't know some basic mathematics, of course, you're not going to be able to process mathematical problems. But a lot of answers to mathematical problems are what we call a priori, which means that they are the kinds of things that you should be able to get at by thinking about them. But of course, you have to have some basic concepts in place. So what Jason Paget, he was dropped out from college before the brain accident, and he did go back to college and study some basic mathematics, because if you don't have the concepts, there's nothing there to process. But that's why I'm saying it's like difficult to answer completely the question with mathematics, because naturally mathematics is a kind of discipline like certain philosophical questions are like that too. So mathematical questions and certain philosophical questions, and probably also certain structures of music. That's something that you could come up with, right, by sitting down and just thinking about it. So and that's what a priori means. It means that it's sort of prior to, it does not involve empirical investigations. It doesn't involve, it's not something you have to explore the world to figure out. So in these cases, perhaps the information in some sense is in there, but again, in this case, I will use your house metaphor, right? You still need some kind of structural foundation, and that those would be the sort of the concepts that can be used to sort of produce the rest. So a lot of these talents that people acquire in brain after brain injury, they are the kinds of things that perhaps could come from inside the brain in some sense, in the sense that a mathematical problem is something that you could solve, in principle, by thinking about it, right? When mathematicians discover new proofs, that maybe they become world famous for discovering a proof of something. That's something they do, right, by using mathematical, the mathematics, the basic concepts and basic rules that they have learned at some point, and then sort of keep playing around with those rules and concepts until they are able to prove something. And when mathematical problems are simple enough, right? So if you are asked to add something in your head that's simple, so say 12 plus 7, right? You can just do it. The information just comes from inside your brain. Even if it happens to be, say, an addition, you have to add 2 numbers that you have never added before. You can do it using the information inside your head, right? So maybe you never added 24 and 23, right? And you can still presumably add them up in your head, and that's, the information comes from inside your head, but you of course have to have the concept of addition and the concept of the number system to be able to do it.
Yes, that certainly adds some clarity in terms of how this could potentially be working. And just so I'm clear, and so the listeners can even dig deeper on this is known as savant syndrome, correct?
Yes. Sometimes we talk about savant abilities because savant syndrome is, or was originally defined as something that people have more or less from early childhood. Though savant abilities is used perhaps more broadly to include people who develop those abilities later in life.
And then a minute ago, you were mentioning just about having this in your brain. Do you think this largely is in part to us just not using enough of our brain?
Not when you put it that way, because any part of your brain that you don't use is gonna be lost, right? Use it or lose it is like the principle with your brain. So if there's a part of the brain that you don't use, then
I'm not the scientist here, so sorry for
no. That's it's repeated. It's repeated in a lot of science fiction movies and so on. And you only use 10% of your brain. But I wouldn't recommend only using 10% of your brain, because you're gonna have a 90% reduction of your brain size or neurons or neural connections. But what might be true underlying that idea is just the formulation of it is sometimes unfortunate. Is the capacity, right? So do you have capacities, brain capacities, that are not currently that are there in the sense of is something that you could cultivate or bring out? It's not, in that sense, that's not currently brought out, right? So it's a room in the brain for developing a talent in a certain area. Yes, there is. There's a lot of capacity that can be developed. I mean, the brain has the capacity, right? So the question is, how do we realize that capacity? So that's a little bit different from saying that when in certain Inception, for example, I think it was said that we only use 10% of our brain. I might be remembering incorrectly here, but certainly in a lot of science fiction movies said that we only use 10% of our brain. How do we fix that idea? Well, we could say maybe we only use 10%. Of course, that would be a random figure, but say 10% of our brain capacity, right? But of course, if it's brain capacity, maybe we only use 1% or even less of our brain capacity. But using our brain or not using parts of our brain makes it a bit sound like it's just some neurons sitting there without doing anything. And that's just not how neurons or living tissue works, right? That if it's just sitting there and it's not engaged in any processes, then you're gonna lose it.
Oh, I'm just so fascinated by all of this, Britt. I'm so intrigued, and we haven't even scratched the surface in terms of your work, but I definitely want to be respectful of your time, and hopefully we can do a round two once everything with COVID clears up, and we'll get to do it in person at your lab at University of Miami. Just a few really quick questions for you before we wrap up here. And you've researched some of the more fascinating things I've ever come across, and I'm wondering, for you personally, what have you just been most fascinated by or most intrigued by with everything you've covered?
One of the things that I think is super intriguing is, and also a problem that I can't solve, and I don't think anyone can solve it, is choice or will, free will. Sometimes we just refer to it as free will, but how are we able, to what extent are we actually able to determine our own path in life, right? And that's a question that I don't foresee that it's going to have clear answer in the near future, but I think it's really fascinating to think about. And even if you don't want to get into the philosophy behind free will, I think that it's fascinating to think about it even in layman's terms, in terms of what kind of influences do we actually have when we make our decisions. I think that sometimes we don't know which influences we have, but in other cases, I think that if we reflect on it, we can figure out what kinds of influences we have. And so that's something that we at least, it seems to me that we have some control over those influences that we can become aware of, right? So it seems to me that we can choose a little bit to be influenced by other people or other things, and that again, it goes back to an idea that is something that I got from political philosophy, which is that if you have a diversity of people and opinions and ideas around you, so if you don't just have the same group of people who think the same as you, do the same as you, but you have people who are very different from you as well, maybe your choices are gonna be more genuinely yours, because if you're exposed to many different and you respect many different systems, value systems and ideas and opinions, then it's not that then you should go along with any opinion, but your choice might be more authentic, the choice you make for yourself.
With regards to surrounding yourself with those different ideas, I would love to just know your favorite thinkers of all time. And I know when you were working on your writing career, when you were still a teen, you wrote about Darwin. I'm wondering who else might have been some of your favorite thinkers of all time.
Oh, there are lots. So even though I'm not a historian, Aristotle certainly has been very influential. If you're talking about very historical figures, also a lot of the existentialists, in the sense, I mean, in terms of reflections on philosophy of mind, I think that they have some interesting things to contribute, and also, of course, in terms of the meaning of life and what's valuable to you in life and so on. So by the existentialists, I primarily mean the French existentialists like Sartre Simone de Beauvoir, Camus, but also, of course, the Danish existentialist Søren Kierkegaard, and so those have inspired me, sort of in a broader sense than just what has inspired a specific article or idea, in an article, but sort of as an overall line of thinking. Those like Aristotle definitely. Also, perhaps, well, in terms of moral philosophy, I would say that the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, who is sort of the father of what sometimes we call the golden rule, but that's the I mean, one way to think about the golden rule. There's different golden rules, of course, out there, but Kant's idea of the golden rule is that it's the idea of respect, that you should respect people, and that's a minimal amount of respect that every person deserves. And when you use people merely as means to your own ends, then you're not giving them that kind of respect. So that has influenced a lot of my thinking in areas sort of a little bit outside of my main areas of academia, but certainly it's influenced how I think about how I behave or how others should behave.
You've given us just a treasure trove of new information to look at and explore. But my final question here as we wrap up. So when we sit down 5 years from today, what would you need to have happened during that time for you to feel good about your progress with your work?
Yeah, so that's a good question, because as the world develops, there are ideas that I can't even fathom right now, but that I will be able to at the time. So new techniques for studying the brain and so on will be available. I do feel that that I want to write some more books that engage the general public. So I want to be able to contribute to problems in society, as well as this sort of fundamental problems in philosophy of mind or in neuroscience. So I would like to make my theories and my research, my empirical research, I would like to make that bear more or even more on everyday problems that are occurring around us, and to be able to contribute to solving some of those problems that everyone has. So in 5 years, I would like to have applied a lot of my ideas to real practical problems, and hopefully have made a little bit of a difference.
Yeah, well, 5 years from now, I'm very much excited to explore that and continue learning from you. But Brit Brogaard, this has been absolutely fascinating. I'm wondering, for the listeners who I know are going to be really intrigued by this, where do you want them staying connected with you, checking out your research, your work? Obviously, we'll have all the books linked in the show notes, but anywhere else you want them staying connected?
For the more accessible things that I sometimes write, that can be quite philosophy related, neuroscience related, or psychology related, is actually on Psychology Today. So the two blogs there, I have one that's called The Mysteries of Love, but it's just sort of a name. I tend to publish more theories of emotions and more things about humanistic areas on that blog. And then there's the one that was named after the book, The Superhuman Mind, where I try to put some of the slightly more scientific, hard science and stuff there, although sometimes it doesn't always work out that way. But those are the two places where I have more accessible material.
Well, fantastic. Well, Brit Brogaard, we will be sure to have all that linked up, but thanks again for joining us on What Got You There.
Yeah, thank you.
You guys made it to the end of another episode of What Got You There. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I really do appreciate you taking the time to listen all the way through. If you found value in this, the best way you can support the show is giving us a review, rating it, sharing it with your friends, and also sharing on social. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. Looking forward to you guys listening to another episode.